The door burst open before Eleanor could pull her hand away from the piano keys, and the sound of the chord she had just played still hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. She spun around, heart slamming against her ribs, and saw Julian Hargrove standing in the frame of the doorway, his cane gripped so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale. He could not see her. He could not see the boy sitting beside her on the piano bench, or the sheet music spread open, or the guilty stillness that had frozen the whole room. But he could hear, and what he had just heard was enough. "Who is playing?" Julian said. His voice was low and controlled, the voice of a man who had spent years training himself not to shout, even when everything inside him wanted to. "Milo does not play piano. Milo has never touched that piano since his mother died. So tell me, right now, who is in this room?" Eleanor's mouth went dry. 8-year-old Milo grabbed her sleeve under the piano, his small fingers trembling, and she understood in that instant that whatever happened next would decide everything. Her job, her home, maybe even Milo's fragile happiness, the only real progress he had made in 3 long years of silence. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. This was the moment Eleanor had been dreading since the very first day she dared to lift the fallboard of that piano and press down on a single dusty key. 3 months earlier, Eleanor Reyes had arrived at the Hargrove estate with nothing but a small suitcase, a letter of reference from her last employer, and a secret she had carried since she was 19 years old. She had once dreamed of becoming a concert pianist. She had trained for 11 years, filled her fingers with calluses and her mind with scales and sonatas, and stood on the edge of a real career before her family's financial collapse pulled her out of every music school and into a world of mops, dust cloths, and other people's houses. She had not touched a piano in 6 years. She told herself she did not miss it. She told herself a great many things to get through each day. The estate itself sat at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by tall iron gates and even taller trees that blocked most of the sunlight from reaching the windows. It was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, cold and polished and slightly untouchable. Eleanor had heard about Julian Hargrove before she ever met him. Everyone in town knew his name. He had built one of the largest shipping companies on the coast from nothing, working his way up from a warehouse clerk to owning half the ports in the region. Then, 3 years ago, a car accident on a rain-soaked highway had taken his sight and his wife in the same terrible night. He survived. She did not. And something in him seemed to have stopped surviving too, even as his body healed. Eleanor's new employer, the housekeeper Margaret Doyle, walked her through the enormous house on her very first morning, listing rules in a brisk, practiced voice. Do not touch anything in the study. Do not speak unless spoken to during meals. Do not, under any circumstances, go near the music room. Why not the music room? Eleanor had asked, more out of curiosity than defiance. Margaret's expression had softened just slightly, the first crack Eleanor had seen in her professional armor. That was Mrs. Hargrove's room. She was a wonderful pianist. Since she passed, Mr. Hargrove has not allowed anyone inside, except to dust it once a month. And young Milo will not go near it either. He has not spoken more than a handful of words since the accident. His mother taught him to play, you see. He was only 5 when it happened, but he remembers enough to miss her. Eleanor had nodded and said nothing more, but something in her chest had tightened at the thought of a little boy who had lost his mother and, along with her, the sound of music in his own home. She did not see Milo for the first 2 weeks. He kept to himself, tutored privately at home by a rotating cast of teachers who came and went with little success. The staff spoke of him gently but sadly, the way people speak about something broken that they have given up trying to fix. He ate his meals alone in his room. He did not play with other children. He walked through the halls like a small ghost, careful and quiet, always keeping his eyes down. It was on a rainy afternoon in her 3rd week, while dusting the east wing, that Eleanor finally saw him properly. She rounded a corner and nearly walked into him standing outside the closed door of the music room, one hand pressed flat against the wood, as if he could feel the silence trapped inside. He did not startle when he noticed her. He simply looked at her with wide, careful eyes, the kind of eyes that had learned to expect disappointment. "You like music," Eleanor said gently, more a statement than a question. Milo did not answer. He never answered anyone directly, but he did not walk away either, and Eleanor took that as a small victory. Over the following days, she found small ways to be near him without pushing too hard. She hummed softly while she worked, old melodies she remembered from her training years, letting the tunes drift through open doorways where she knew he could hear them. She noticed how his steps would slow whenever she did this, how he would linger just a little longer in the hallway outside whatever room she was cleaning. He never said a word about it. He never had to. Eleanor recognized hunger when she saw it, because she had lived with a hunger of her own for 6 long years. The idea came to her almost by accident. She had been assigned to dust the music room one Tuesday morning, a task she always dreaded because of how forbidden it felt, how heavy the silence sat inside those four walls. The grand piano stood in the center of the room like a monument, its black surface gleaming despite months of disuse. She ran her cloth along its edge, careful, respectful, and then, without quite deciding to, she lifted the fallboard and looked at the keys underneath. They were perfectly in tune. Someone had kept up the maintenance, even if no one dared to play. She should have closed it immediately. She knew the rules, but her fingers moved almost on their own, resting lightly on the keys without pressing down, feeling the smooth, familiar coolness of the ivory beneath her skin. For the first time in 6 years, her chest ached with a longing she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it was gone. That was when she heard the small intake of breath behind her. Milo stood in the doorway, staring at her hands on the keys with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not fear, not sadness, something closer to hope, fragile and flickering, like a candle in a room full of drafts. "Do you want to hear something?" Eleanor asked softly. And for the first time in 3 months at that house, Milo nodded. She played only a few bars, something simple and gentle, a lullaby she remembered from childhood. Her fingers were rusty, stiff from years of disuse, but the melody still came out true. When she finished, she turned to look at him, half expecting him to have already vanished back into his silent world. Instead, Milo took 2 slow steps into the room, walked to the piano bench, and, very carefully, sat down beside her. That was how it began. Not with a grand plan or a bold decision, but with one small, quiet moment that neither of them fully understood the weight of yet. Eleanor knew she was breaking a rule. She knew that if anyone found out, especially Julian Hargrove, she could lose her position immediately, perhaps even face something worse. But watching Milo's small fingers hover uncertainly above the keys, watching the first flicker of real interest cross his face in longer than anyone could remember, she found she could not bring herself to stop. She showed him where to place his thumb. She showed him one single note, middle C, and asked him to press it down. The sound rang out clear and bright through the room, and Milo's whole body seemed to lean toward it, drawn like a plant toward sunlight after a long winter. "Again," he whispered. It was the first word Eleanor had ever heard him speak. She did not tell anyone what had happened that day. She told herself it was a single moment, an exception, something that would not happen again. But the very next afternoon, she found herself once more standing outside the music room with her cleaning cart, glancing down the hallway to make sure no one was watching before slipping inside. Milo was already waiting for her, sitting on the bench with his hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes bright with an anticipation that broke her heart and mended it at the same time. She could not turn him away. She would not. And so, without ever intending to, Eleanor Reyes became something she had never planned to be in that house. Not just a maid, not just a servant moving quietly through someone else's grief. She became the one small crack of light in a boy's silent world, a secret held between 2 people in a house where secrets, she was about to learn, never stayed buried for long. Because somewhere down the hall, behind the closed door of his study, Julian Hargrove was beginning to notice that something in his son had changed. He could not see the smile that sometimes touched Milo's lips at dinner. He could not see the new steadiness in his son's steps. But he could hear the difference in his voice when Milo spoke, however rarely, and he could feel it in the air of the house itself, a shift so subtle that anyone else might have missed it entirely. Julian Hargrove missed very little, and on the afternoon he finally followed the faint, familiar echo of music drifting down the East Wing hallway. The secret Eleanor had guarded so carefully for weeks was about to collide head-on with the truth. Eleanor's hands were still frozen above the keys when Julian took a slow step into the room, his cane tapping once against the polished floor before he stopped. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with a weight that filled every space he entered, a stillness that made people choose their words carefully. His sightless eyes moved across the room as though searching for something he could not name, and Eleanor realized with a jolt that he was listening, truly listening, in a way sighted people rarely bothered to. "Answer me," he said again, quieter this time, which somehow made it worse. "Who was playing that piano?" Milo's grip on her sleeve tightened. Eleanor looked down at the boy, at the fear written plainly across his face, and something inside her steadied. Whatever punishment came next, she would not let Milo carry the blame for it. "It was me, sir," she said. "Eleanor. I cleaned the East Wing." Julian's jaw tightened. "The maid." "Yes, sir. You were told never to enter this room except to dust it. Those were Margaret's instructions, were they not?" "They were, sir. And yet here you are." playing my wife's piano, with my son beside you." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Eleanor could hear her own pulse in her ears. She glanced at Milo, who was staring up at his father with an expression she had never seen on him before, somewhere between hope and terror, as though he were waiting to see whether the fragile new world he had built over the past weeks was about to be taken away from him all over again. "I should call Margaret and have you dismissed this instant," Julian said. His voice had gone flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had trained himself never to lose his temper, because losing his temper felt too much like losing control of everything else in his life as well. "Do you understand what that piano means in this house? Do you understand what it means to my son?" "I think I do, sir," Eleanor said carefully. "That is why I could not simply walk away when he wanted to learn." Julian's head turned sharply toward her voice. "He wanted to learn?" "Yes, sir. My son has refused every tutor I have hired for the past 3 years. He has refused speech therapists, counselors, specialists flown in from 3 different countries. He sits in silence no matter who tries to reach him. And you are telling me that in a matter of weeks, you have succeeded where all of them failed." Eleanor hesitated. She could hear the disbelief in his voice, sharp and defensive, the tone of a father who had spent years watching his child slip further away and had grown weary of false hope. "I did not do anything special, sir. I only played, and he wanted to listen. Then he wanted to try it himself. I could not say no to that. You had no right to make that decision for me." "No, sir, I did not." Eleanor's voice trembled slightly, but she did not look away, even though he could not see her steady gaze. "But I did not think you would want me to say no to him either, not when it was the first thing he had asked for in longer than anyone could remember." Milo, who had been silent through the entire exchange, suddenly spoke. His voice was small but clear. "Papa, please do not send her away." Julian's entire body went still. Eleanor watched something break open across his face, a crack in the careful composure he had worn since the moment he entered the room. He turned toward the sound of his son's voice, his hand reaching out uncertainly until his fingers found Milo's shoulder. "You spoke," Julian said softly, as though he could hardly believe it, even though he had clearly heard the words. "Milo, you spoke to me." "I did not want to before," Milo said, his voice growing slightly steadier. "But Eleanor said it was all right to talk when I had something I wanted to say. She said words are not dangerous. She said sound is not something to be afraid of." Julian's throat moved as he swallowed hard. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and Eleanor stood frozen, unsure whether she was witnessing the beginning of forgiveness or simply the calm before a storm that would still end with her packing her suitcase and walking out through the iron gates by evening. "Leave us," Julian finally said, though his voice had lost its earlier hardness. "I would like to speak with my son alone." Eleanor nodded, forgetting for a moment that he could not see the gesture, and quietly made her way toward the door. Milo's eyes followed her the entire way, wide with worry, and she gave him the smallest, most reassuring smile she could manage, before slipping out into the hallway and closing the door softly behind her. She stood there for a long moment, her back against the wall, her heart still pounding. Through the thick wood, she could hear the low murmur of voices, though she could not make out the words. She did not know whether she still had a job. She did not know whether she would ever be allowed near that piano, or that boy again. Margaret found her there 20 minutes later, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "He wants to see you in his study," she said. "Now." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She followed Margaret down the long corridor toward the study, past portraits of Hargrove ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to watch her pass, past the tall windows that let in thin bars of gray afternoon light. Margaret did not say another word, but as they reached the study door, she paused and looked at Eleanor with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been warning. "Whatever happens in there," Margaret said quietly, "know that in 3 years I have never once heard that boy speak a full sentence to his father. Not once. Whatever you did, you should be proud of it, even if it cost you this position." The words offered little comfort as Eleanor knocked on the study door and heard Julian's voice call for her to enter. The study was smaller than she expected, warm despite the cold formality of the rest of the house, lined with shelves of books that Eleanor suspected had not been read since the accident took Julian's sight. He sat behind a heavy wooden desk, his hands folded in front of him, his sightless eyes fixed somewhere just past her shoulder. "Sit down," he said. Eleanor sat. "I have spoken with my son," Julian began, his voice measured, careful, the voice of a man choosing each word with great deliberation. "He tells me you have been teaching him piano in secret for several weeks. He tells me you taught him his first note, and that you have been patient with him in a way no one else has managed to be. I only wanted to help him, sir. I never meant to go against your wishes. I understand that. What I do not understand, Julian said, leaning forward slightly, is why you would risk your position in this house for a boy you barely know. You could have lost your job. You could have been sent away without a reference, without any explanation. Why would you take that risk? Eleanor thought carefully before answering. Because I know what it feels like to lose the thing you love most, sir. I trained for 11 years to become a pianist. I gave up nearly everything for it. And then, when my family needed me, I had to walk away from it completely. I have not touched a piano in 6 years, not until the day I found your son standing outside that door, staring at it like it held every answer he was searching for. I could not walk past that. I could not pretend I did not understand exactly what that kind of silence feels like. Julian was quiet for a long moment. His fingers tapped once against the surface of his desk, an unconscious habit, before he spoke again. My wife was the only person who ever understood our son the way you seem to understand him. She was the one who taught him to play. After she died, I could not bring myself to let anyone touch that piano. I told myself it was because Milo needed stability, that too much change would hurt him further. But the truth is, I could not bear to hear that instrument played by anyone but her. I was protecting my own grief, not my son. That is understandable, sir, Eleanor said gently. Grief does not always make sense from the outside. No, Julian agreed, it does not. He was silent again, and Eleanor waited, unsure what would come next. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. I have decided not to dismiss you. Relief flooded through Eleanor so suddenly that she nearly forgot to breathe. However, Julian continued, I cannot simply allow this to continue as it has been, hidden from me, treated as something shameful to be discovered by accident. If my son is going to learn piano again, if he is finally ready to speak and laugh and live in this house the way he used to, then I want to understand every part of it. I want to know what you are teaching him, and why, and how. Of course, sir. I would like to be present for his next lesson, Julian said, not to interfere, simply to listen. Eleanor blinked in surprise. Of all the outcomes she had imagined walking into that study, this was not one of them. You want to attend the lesson yourself, sir. I have been absent from too much of my son's life these past 3 years, Julian said, and for the first time, Eleanor heard something raw beneath his careful composure, something that sounded almost like shame. I told myself it was because I could not see him grow, could not watch him the way a father should, but that was never really true, was it? I could still hear him. I simply stopped listening. Eleanor did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and allowed the silence to hold the weight of his admission without trying to soften it. Tomorrow afternoon, Julian said finally, 3 o'clock. I would like you to teach him as you normally would, and I will sit in the room while you do. I understand, sir. As Eleanor rose to leave, Julian added one more thing, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Thank you, for not asking my permission before you began. I do not think I would have given it, 3 months ago, and I think that refusal would have been one more mistake in a very long list I have made since the accident. Eleanor left the study with her heart still racing, but for entirely different reasons than when she had entered it. She had not lost her position. She had not lost the fragile connection she had built with Milo. And somewhere in that cold, grief-heavy house, something had shifted. Something she sensed would not easily shift back. That night, lying awake in her small room on the 3rd floor, Eleanor thought about the look on Julian's face when he heard his son speak a full sentence for the first time in 3 years. She thought about the crack in his composure, the shame beneath his careful control, the loneliness of a man who had built an empire out of nothing, but had somehow lost the ability to reach the one person who mattered most to him. She wondered, not for the first time, what kind of man Julian Hargrove truly was, beneath the cold reputation that preceded him through every room he entered. She would find out sooner than she expected. Because the following afternoon, when she walked into the music room to find Julian already seated in the corner chair, his hands folded in his lap, his sightless eyes turned toward the piano with an intensity that made her breath catch, Eleanor understood that something far larger than piano lessons had begun in that house. And she had no way of knowing yet just how far it would carry all 3 of them before the story reached its end. The weeks that followed changed the rhythm of the entire house. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, Julian took his seat in the corner of the music room, and every afternoon, Eleanor guided Milo's fingers across the keys, while Father listened in silence, absorbing every note as though it were a message meant only for him. Milo grew bolder with each passing day. He began speaking not just to Eleanor but to Margaret, to the gardener, even to the quiet driver who brought groceries twice a week. The house that had felt like a museum of grief slowly began to feel, in small and fragile ways, like a home again. Eleanor should have felt only relief. Instead, she found herself carrying a new kind of nervousness, one she could not quite name at first. It crept in during the quiet moments after each lesson, when Julian would linger in the doorway, instead of returning immediately to his study, asking her questions about music theory, about her own training, about the years she had spent chasing a dream that financial hardship had eventually stolen from her. He listened to her answers with the same intensity he brought to Milo's playing, as though her voice, too, was something worth paying close attention to. She told herself it meant nothing. He was a father grateful for his son's recovery, nothing more. She reminded herself of the enormous gap between them, the impossible distance between a housemaid and a millionaire, a distance that no amount of shared afternoons in a music room could ever truly close. But reminding herself of these things did little to slow the way her pulse quickened whenever she heard his cane tapping down the hallway toward the music room each afternoon. It was on a gray Thursday morning, 6 weeks after Julian first discovered the secret lessons, that everything Eleanor had carefully built began to unravel. She was polishing silverware in the kitchen when Margaret rushed in, her face pale, her usual composure entirely gone. "She is here," Margaret said, breathless. "Mrs. Wren, Julian's late wife's sister. She has come without warning, and she is already in the study demanding to see him." Eleanor had heard Julian mention his sister-in-law only once, briefly, with a tightness in his voice that told her the subject was not a comfortable one. Vivian Wren had made no secret, apparently, of her belief that Julian was unfit to raise Milo alone, blind and grieving as he was, and had spent the past 3 years quietly building a case, gathering opinions from doctors and family friends, waiting for the right moment to act. Eleanor did not think much of it at first, assuming it was simply another difficult family visit that had nothing to do with her. She was wrong. Less than an hour later, Margaret appeared again at the kitchen door, her expression grim. "Eleanor, Mr. Hargrove wants you in the study. Now. Mrs. Wren is asking for you specifically." Eleanor's stomach twisted as she made her way down the hallway, her mind racing through every possible reason a stranger might want to speak with her. When she stepped into the study, she found Julian standing near the window, his shoulders rigid, his jaw set in a hard line. Across from him sat a sharply dressed woman with cold, assessing eyes, a woman who looked at Eleanor the way one might look at an insect that had wandered somewhere it did not belong. "So this is her," Vivian said, without preamble. "The maid who has been giving my nephew unsupervised piano lessons behind his father's back for weeks." "They are no longer unsupervised," Julian said sharply. "I have attended every lesson myself for the past 6 weeks." "Every lesson since you were caught, you mean?" Vivian replied, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Julian, think about how this looks. A young, unqualified woman, alone in a room with your blind son, day after day, without your knowledge, and you are telling me this is nothing to be concerned about." "Milo is speaking again, Vivian. He is laughing. He asked me last week if we could visit his mother's grave together, something he has refused to do since the funeral. Do you understand what that means to me? I understand that you are a grieving, disabled father who has been desperate for any sign of hope, and this woman took advantage of that desperation," Vivian said, turning her sharp gaze back to Eleanor. "I have already spoken with a lawyer. I intend to file for a formal review of Milo's guardianship arrangements. I will be recommending that he come live with me, where he can be properly supervised by someone who is not compromised by grief, or blindness, or clearly inappropriate attachments to household staff." The room went silent. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She had expected accusations, perhaps even dismissal, but she had never imagined the conversation could spiral into something as serious as a custody battle, with Milo's entire future hanging in the balance because of the risk she had chosen to take. "You cannot be serious," Julian said, his voice low and dangerous now, all trace of his earlier composure gone. "You have no grounds for this. I have 3 years of documented concern from doctors who worried about Milo's isolation, a housemaid with no formal teaching credentials, who has been alone with a vulnerable child, and a father who admits he did not even know what was happening in his own home for weeks. I have more than enough grounds, Julian, and you know it." Eleanor's voice, when it finally came, surprised even herself with its steadiness. "Mrs. Wren, with respect, I understand your concern for Milo's well-being. I share it. But what you are describing is not what has happened in this house. Milo is not isolated anymore. He speaks. He laughs. He has begun asking questions about his mother instead of avoiding every memory of her. If you truly care about his welfare, you would see that what has changed here is progress, not danger." "I did not ask for your opinion," Vivian snapped. "No," Eleanor agreed quietly, "but I am giving it anyway. Because I have spent every afternoon for the past 2 months watching that boy come back to life, and I will not stand here silently while someone threatens to take that away from him, simply because it makes you uncomfortable." Vivian's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, Julian stepped forward, his hand finding the edge of the desk to orient himself, his voice carrying a quiet authority that filled the entire room. "Vivian, I will fight you on this with every resource I have. You know my history with the courts. You know the lawyers I have access to. If you pursue this, you will lose, and you will spend a great deal of money proving that you have no real case beyond your own discomfort with a household you do not control." Vivian's composure flickered for just a moment, before she gathered herself, standing abruptly and smoothing the front of her jacket. "We will see about that," she said. "I will be filing the paperwork by the end of the week. Enjoy these last few weeks of pretending everything is fine, Julian. I doubt they will last." She swept out of the study without another word, leaving a heavy silence behind her. Eleanor stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, the full weight of what had just happened settling over her like a stone. "I am so sorry," she said finally. "This is my fault. If I had never touched that piano, none of this would be happening." "Do not apologize," Julian said sharply, then softened, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of exhaustion Eleanor had never seen him display before. "Vivian has been looking for a reason to challenge my guardianship since the day of the accident. She believes a blind man cannot properly raise a child alone, no matter how much evidence exists to the contrary. This was always going to happen eventually. You simply gave her a slightly different angle to attack from. What happens now?" "Now," Julian said, straightening his shoulders, "we make sure there is nothing for her to find except a boy who is happier, healthier, and more himself than he has been in 3 years. We make sure the court sees exactly what I see when I sit in that music room every afternoon. Progress. Life returning to this house." Eleanor nodded, though anxiety still churned in her stomach. "And what about me? If the lessons are part of what she is challenging, perhaps it would be safer if I stepped back, let a certified tutor take over instead." "Absolutely not," Julian said, before she had even finished the sentence, his voice firm. "Milo trusts you. He opened up to you in a way he has not managed with anyone else in 3 years, including trained professionals with far more credentials than either of us could list. Removing you now would undo everything we have built, and it would hand Vivian exactly the disruption she is hoping to find. No, you stay. We simply make certain everything moving forward is documented properly, transparently, so there is no question about what is happening in this house." Over the following days, the estate transformed into something resembling a quiet battlefield. Julian arranged for a child psychologist to observe several of Milo's lessons and provide written assessments of his progress. He requested that Margaret keep detailed records of the household routine, meals, sleep, schoolwork, everything that could demonstrate stability and care. Eleanor found herself not just teaching piano, but carefully documenting every lesson, every small breakthrough, every word Milo spoke, building a paper trail of proof against a woman determined to tear their fragile new world apart. Milo, sensing the tension in the house despite everyone's efforts to shield him from it, grew quieter again for a few days, retreating slightly into the careful silence he had only recently begun to leave behind. Eleanor watched it happen with a growing ache in her chest, terrified that all their progress was slipping backward, undone by a threat the boy could sense but not fully understand. It was Julian, surprisingly, who found the way to reach him. One evening, instead of retreating to his study after dinner as he usually did, he asked Milo to walk with him to the music room. Eleanor, passing by in the hallway with an armful of linens, paused when she heard Julian's voice drifting through the partially open door. "I know something feels different in the house lately," Julian was saying, his voice gentle in a way Eleanor had rarely heard him use. "I know you can sense that something is wrong, even if no one has explained it to you properly. I am sorry for that. You deserve better than being kept in the dark." "Is Aunt Vivian going to make me leave?" Milo asked, his small voice tight with fear. "No," Julian said firmly. "I will not let that happen. I promise you that, Milo, with everything I have." "But what if you cannot stop her?" There was a long pause before Julian answered, and when he did, his voice carried a rawness Eleanor had never heard from him before. "Then I will fight until there is nothing left to fight with. You are my son. I lost your mother 3 years ago, and I spent far too long after that acting as though I had lost you too, simply because I could not see you the way I used to. I will not lose you again, to anyone, for any reason. Do you understand me?" Eleanor heard the soft sound of Milo moving across the room, followed by the quiet rustle of an embrace, and she stood frozen in the hallway, her arms full of linens, tears unexpectedly gathering in her eyes. Whatever else happened, whatever legal battle loomed ahead of them, she understood in that moment that the bond being rebuilt between father and son was stronger than anything Vivian Wren could hope to tear apart. But the danger was far from over. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived at the estate, delivered by a stern-faced courier who refused to leave without a signature. Eleanor watched from the hallway as Margaret carried it to Julian's study, her expression grave, and she felt the same cold dread settle over her that had gripped the house since Vivian's first visit. The court hearing had been scheduled. In 2 weeks, a judge would decide whether Julian Hargrove, blind and grieving, aided by a housemaid with no formal credentials, was truly fit to raise his son alone, or whether Milo would be taken from the only home he had ever known and placed into the custody of an aunt who saw compassion as weakness and progress as danger. Eleanor stood outside the study door that evening, listening to the low murmur of Julian's voice as he spoke quietly with his lawyer on the phone, and she made a silent promise to herself. Whatever it took, whatever sacrifice was required, she would not let this family be torn apart by someone who had never once bothered to sit in that music room and listen to what real healing actually sounded like. The 2 weeks that followed would test every bit of courage she had. The 2 weeks before the hearing passed in a blur of preparation, tension, and quiet determination. Julian's lawyer, a sharp, steady woman named Charlotte Bennett, visited the estate 3 times to review evidence, interview staff, and prepare Julian for the difficult questions Vivian's legal team would likely raise in court. Eleanor found herself interviewed as well, sitting across from Charlotte in the study, answering careful questions about her background, her training, and every detail of how the piano lessons had begun. They will try to paint you as someone who manipulated a vulnerable child for personal gain, Charlotte warned her bluntly. They may even suggest something inappropriate about your relationship with Mr. Hargrove himself. You need to be prepared for that kind of attack, and you need to answer every question honestly and calmly, no matter how it is phrased. Eleanor's stomach twisted at the thought, but she nodded, understanding the necessity of the warning even as it filled her with dread. She had never imagined that a few quiet piano lessons could spiral into something that threatened not only her employment, but her reputation, and far more importantly, the fragile new life Milo had only just begun to build. Milo himself grew increasingly anxious as the hearing date approached, though he tried hard to hide it. Eleanor noticed the way his hands trembled slightly before each lesson now, the way he sometimes stopped mid-piece and asked, in a small voice, whether he would still be allowed to play piano if he had to go live with his aunt. Eleanor always answered honestly, telling him she did not know for certain, but that his father was fighting with everything he had to make sure that never happened. "I do not want to leave," Milo told her one afternoon, his fingers resting still on the keys. "I do not want to leave Papa. I do not want to leave you either." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "I know," she said softly. "And your father knows it too. That is exactly why he is fighting so hard." The night before the hearing, Eleanor could not sleep. She lay awake in her small third-floor room, staring at the ceiling, running through every possible question the lawyers might ask. Every way the truth of her feelings toward Julian might be twisted into something ugly and inappropriate in a courtroom. Because that was the truth she had been avoiding for weeks now, the truth she had barely admitted even to herself. Somewhere in the quiet afternoons of piano lessons and careful conversations, she had begun to care for Julian Hargrove in a way that went far beyond simple respect for her employer. She heard a soft knock on her door just past midnight and opened it to find Julian standing in the hallway, his cane in hand, his expression unusually uncertain for a man who typically carried himself with unshakable composure. "I am sorry to disturb you so late," he said. "I could not sleep, and I found myself wanting to speak with you before tomorrow." Eleanor stepped aside to let him into the small sitting area near her room, her heart pounding for reasons that had little to do with the hearing ahead. "Is something wrong?" "I wanted to thank you," Julian said. "Before tomorrow happens, whatever the outcome may be, I do not know if Charlotte has told you how serious this could become. If we lose, Vivian will have grounds to challenge my guardianship further, to bring in additional witnesses, to drag this out for months, perhaps years. And through all of it, you will be scrutinized, questioned, perhaps even publicly criticized in ways that are deeply unfair, simply because you chose kindness over caution 3 months ago. I do not regret it," Eleanor said quietly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I do not regret a single lesson." Julian was silent for a long moment, his sightless eyes turned toward the sound of her voice with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I have not felt this way about the future in 3 years, he said finally. "Not since the accident. I stopped believing anything good could still happen in this house. And then you walked into that music room and touched a piano you were told never to touch, and everything began to change. Milo is not the only one you brought back to life, Eleanor. I think you know that. Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could somehow hear it, despite the careful distance between them. Julian, she said softly, using his first name for the first time since she had arrived at the estate. Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that I am not doing any of this because of my position in this house, or because of anything I might hope to gain. I am doing it because I care about Milo, and because, she paused, gathering courage, because I care about you too. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Julian reached out slowly, his hand finding hers in the quiet darkness of the room, and Eleanor let him hold it, understanding that whatever the courtroom decided the next day, something between them had already shifted into something neither of them could easily take back. The following morning arrived gray and heavy with tension. Eleanor dressed carefully, her hands shaking slightly as she fastened the buttons of her modest blouse, and made her way downstairs to find the entire household already gathered near the front entrance, ready for the drive into the city. Milo sat quietly in the car between Eleanor and Julian, his small hand gripping hers tightly the entire way, his eyes wide with a fear no 8-year-old should ever have to carry. The courtroom itself was smaller than Eleanor had imagined, cold and formal, with hard wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everyone's faces look pale and drawn. Vivian sat across the aisle with her lawyer, dressed in an expensive dark suit, her expression carefully composed into something resembling concern, though Eleanor recognized the calculation beneath it. The hearing began with Vivian's lawyer presenting their case, painting a picture of a grieving, disabled father who had allowed an unqualified household employee unsupervised access to his vulnerable son, citing missed appointments with specialists, Milo's years of silence, and the sudden, unexplained secrecy of the piano lessons as evidence of poor judgment and inadequate supervision. Eleanor sat rigid in her seat, her hands clenched in her lap, listening to weeks of careful, loving progress described as recklessness and manipulation. When Charlotte rose to present their side, she called Margaret first, who spoke firmly about the household's careful routines, Milo's documented improvement, and the transparency Julian had insisted upon from the moment he discovered the lessons. Then came the child psychologist, who presented weeks of written assessments detailing Milo's remarkable progress, his increased speech, his emotional stability, his willingness to discuss his mother's death for the first time since the funeral. Then Charlotte called Eleanor to the stand. Eleanor's legs felt unsteady as she walked to the witness box, but she forced herself to breathe evenly, to remember Charlotte's advice, to answer every question honestly and without hesitation. Vivian's lawyer cross-examined her sharply, questioning her credentials, her motives, even suggesting, as Charlotte had warned, that her closeness with Julian raised concerns about her judgment and objectivity. "Is it true," the lawyer asked, his tone dripping with implication, "that you have developed a personal relationship with Mr. Hargrove that goes beyond your professional duties in his household?" Eleanor felt her face flush, but she held the lawyer's gaze steadily. "I care about this family. Yes, I care about Milo's well-being. And I have come to respect and admire Mr. Hargrove a great deal over these past months. I do not see how genuine care for the people I work for should be treated as a character flaw. And do you believe that closeness might have clouded your judgment regarding what is truly best for an 8-year-old child?" "I believe," Eleanor said, her voice growing steadier with each word, "that watching a child go from 3 years of near total silence to laughing, speaking, and asking to visit his mother's grave is exactly the kind of judgment that should be trusted, not questioned. I did not manipulate Milo into anything. I offered him music, because I recognized in him the same hunger I once carried myself, and he reached for it on his own. Everything that has happened since has been his choice, supported by a father who loves him more than anything else in this world." A murmur passed through the courtroom, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of Julian's face, his expression unreadable but his jaw set with something that looked almost like pride. Vivian's lawyer tried several more angles, but Eleanor held firm, answering each question with the same calm honesty, refusing to let fear or embarrassment shake her conviction. Finally, it was Milo's turn. The judge had agreed, after much deliberation, to speak with Milo privately in her chambers, away from the tension of the full courtroom, accompanied only by a court-appointed advocate. Eleanor watched him disappear through the side door, his small shoulders squared with a bravery that broke her heart, and the wait that followed felt like the longest hour of her entire life. When Milo finally emerged, his eyes were red, but his expression was calm, almost peaceful, and Eleanor felt a flicker of hope for the first time since the hearing began. The judge returned to her seat and addressed the courtroom with the measured authority of someone who had weighed every piece of evidence carefully. "I have reviewed the assessments provided by Dr. Alvarez, the testimony of the household staff, and I have spoken personally with Milo Hargrove, she said. It is clear to this court that the child's well-being has significantly improved over the past several months, both emotionally and socially. While I understand the petitioner's concerns regarding informal supervision and irregular circumstances, I find no evidence of neglect, manipulation, or genuine risk to this child's safety or development. In fact, the evidence strongly suggests the opposite. Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she could barely hear the rest of the judge's words, but she caught the final ruling clearly enough, the words that would change everything. This court finds no grounds to alter the current custody arrangement. Guardianship remains with Julian Hargrove. A wave of relief crashed over Eleanor so intensely that tears sprang to her eyes before she could stop them. Beside her, she heard Julian release a long, unsteady breath, and across the courtroom, Vivian's composed mask finally cracked into open frustration as she gathered her things and left without another word. Outside the courthouse, Milo ran straight into his father's arms, and Julian knelt down despite his cane, wrapping his son in an embrace so tight and so full of relief that several onlookers paused to watch. Eleanor stood a short distance away, wiping tears from her own eyes, until Julian reached out one hand toward the sound of her quiet crying. "Come here," he said softly. "This victory belongs to you, just as much as it belongs to us." Eleanor stepped forward, and for a moment, standing on the courthouse steps with Milo between them and the gray morning finally breaking into pale sunlight overhead, she allowed herself to believe that the hardest part of their story was finally behind them. She could not have known yet just how much more Julian still had planned. Life in the Hargrove household changed noticeably in the weeks following the hearing. The heavy silence that had once filled every corridor gave way to something lighter, something almost unfamiliar in its warmth. Milo began inviting neighborhood children over for the first time in 3 years, his laughter echoing through rooms that had long stood empty of joy. Julian, too, seemed to move through the house differently, his shoulders less burdened, his voice carrying a new steadiness that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with hope. Eleanor continued the piano lessons each afternoon, though now Julian rarely missed a single one, sitting in his usual corner chair, occasionally offering gentle encouragement or requesting a piece his late wife had once loved to play. There was no more hiding, no more secrecy, only the simple, steady rhythm of a family slowly rebuilding itself around the sound of music. But something else had also changed, something neither Eleanor nor Julian spoke about directly, though both of them felt its presence in every quiet glance, every lingering conversation after Milo had gone to bed. The late-night confession before the hearing had opened a door neither of them seemed willing to close again, and though propriety and the careful boundaries of employer and employee kept them from acting on it openly, the air between them crackled with something unspoken and undeniable. It was Margaret, of all people, who finally addressed it directly. She found Eleanor in the kitchen one evening, polishing silver with more focus than the task truly required, and set down her own work with a knowing look. "You know," Margaret said, "in 15 years working in this house, I have never seen Mr. Hargrove smile as often as he has these past few months. Not even before the accident, if I am honest with you." Eleanor kept her eyes on the silverware. "I am glad Milo has brought him so much happiness." Margaret laughed softly, a warm sound Eleanor had rarely heard from her. "Milo is not the only reason for that smile, dear, and I think you know it as well as I do." Eleanor said nothing, but her cheeks warmed, and Margaret's knowing smile only widened before she returned to her own work, leaving Eleanor alone with thoughts she had been carefully avoiding for weeks. The true turning point came nearly 2 months after the hearing, on a warm spring evening, when Milo's piano teacher, a proper certified instructor Julian had eventually hired to supplement Eleanor's lessons with formal technique, suggested that Milo was ready to perform publicly for the first time. A small community recital was being held at the local arts center the following month, and though Milo's initial reaction was nervous hesitation, Eleanor spent the following weeks helping him prepare, choosing a piece that felt meaningful rather than simply impressive, one his mother had once played for him as a lullaby when he was very small. The night of the recital arrived with a nervous energy that filled the entire household. Milo paced the halls in his small formal suit, running through the piece in his head, while Julian dressed carefully despite being unable to see his own reflection, asking Eleanor twice whether his tie was straight. Eleanor found herself equally nervous, though she told herself it was only concern for Milo's performance, not the flutter of anticipation that came whenever Julian's hand brushed hers as they made their way to the car. The arts center was modest but full. Rows of folding chairs filled with parents, siblings, and community members gathered to watch children of all ages perform. Eleanor sat beside Julian in the front row, Milo's empty chair between them until it was his turn. and she felt Julian's hand find hers in the darkness of the auditorium, as Milo's name was finally called. Milo walked onto the small stage with visible nerves, but the moment he sat down at the piano and placed his fingers on the keys, something in him steadied, the same quiet transformation Eleanor had witnessed in that music room months earlier. He began to play, the melody filling the auditorium with a gentle, aching beauty that seemed far too mature for a child his age, a piece filled with the memory of a mother he had lost and a father he was only now truly rediscovering. Eleanor glanced sideways at Julian and saw tears sliding silently down his face, his expression a mixture of grief and pride so profound it took her breath away. When Milo finished, the applause that followed was warm and genuine, and Milo's small face broke into a smile so bright it seemed to light up the entire room. After the recital, as families gathered near the refreshment tables to congratulate the young performers, Julian found a quiet moment to pull Eleanor aside, away from the crowd, near a small garden courtyard just outside the auditorium doors. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice unusually uncertain for a man who had built an empire out of confidence and calculated risk. "I have spent 3 years believing that whatever life I had left would be defined entirely by what I had lost. My wife, my sight, the version of myself that used to move through the world without fear. And then you arrived in my house, and slowly, without either of us quite realizing it was happening, you gave me back pieces of a life I thought were gone forever." Eleanor's heart pounded as she listened, the warm evening air settling around them, the distant sound of Milo's laughter drifting from somewhere near the refreshment tables. "I am not asking you to answer me tonight," Julian continued, "but I need you to know what I feel, plainly and honestly, because you deserve honesty after everything you have given this family. I have fallen in love with you, Eleanor. Not because of what you did for Milo, though I will be endlessly grateful for that for the rest of my life, but because of who you are, your patience, your courage, the way you speak to me as though my blindness is simply one part of who I am, not the whole of it. I do not know what the future looks like for two people from such different worlds, but I know I do not want to find out what my life looks like without you in it." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her own eyes, and she reached out, gently taking his hand in both of hers. "You do not need to worry about the answer, Julian," she said softly. "I fell in love with you somewhere between that first afternoon in the music room and every quiet evening since. I was simply too afraid to say it first." Julian's face broke into a smile so genuine, so unguarded, that Eleanor felt the last of her own hesitation dissolve completely. He reached up carefully, his fingers finding her face with the gentle precision of a man who had learned to see the world through touch, and kissed her softly beneath the warm evening sky, the sound of Milo's distant laughter serving as the perfect, unexpected soundtrack to the moment neither of them had dared to imagine just a few short months earlier. In the months that followed, the Hargrove estate transformed into something none of the staff had ever thought possible. The music room, once locked away in grief, became the heart of the house once more, filled almost daily with the sound of piano lessons, laughter, and conversation. Eleanor eventually left her position as housemaid, not because she was dismissed, but because Julian formally hired her as Milo's full-time music instructor, a role that came with proper credentials, fair compensation, and most importantly, the freedom to pursue the passion she had once believed lost forever. A year after that first stolen afternoon at the piano, Julian and Eleanor were married in a small, quiet ceremony held in the very garden courtyard where he had first confessed his feelings, with Milo standing proudly beside his father, holding the rings with careful, steady hands. Margaret cried through the entire ceremony, insisting loudly to anyone who would listen that she had known from the very first week that something remarkable was going to happen in that house. Vivian did not attend the wedding, though she eventually sent a brief, stiff letter of reconciliation the following year, an olive branch Julian accepted with quiet grace, choosing forgiveness over lingering resentment, understanding perhaps better than anyone the danger of letting grief calcify into permanent bitterness. Milo continued to play piano well into his teenage years, eventually performing at recitals across the region, always crediting the same woman who had once broken every rule of the house to teach him his very first note. He grew into a confident, thoughtful young man, carrying his mother's memory not as a wound but as a quiet, steady presence woven into every piece of music he played. Eleanor often thought back to that first terrifying moment when Julian burst through the music room door, certain in that instant that everything she had built was about to collapse around her. She understood now, looking back, that it had not been the ending she feared, but the beginning of something far greater than she ever could have imagined. A father who learned to listen again, a son who found his voice, and a woman who had once given up on her own dreams, only to discover that sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is play a single quiet note in a room they were never supposed to enter. and trust that the sound might be enough to change everything. It was.